Hello everyone, it's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. Ben Carson, you found the first black person in the Trump administration. You give him a HUD home, even though the guy was a surgeon. He has nothing to do with HUD, and yet they put him in charge of HUD. I suspect that Trump really didn't necessarily care who was in charge of these offices. And in this case, he understood what each of these people were going to do, which is essentially destroy the offices that they were put into. Ben Carson has just tripled the rents on people at the bottom of the low end of the totem pole. His answer to this, or his reason for this, is I am tripling rents because I'm trying to help these people get out of poverty. I'm trying to help these people get out of poverty by pushing them further into poverty. Ben Carson's defending housing assistance proposal gives the poor a way out of poverty. No. It's kind of the opposite. Housing and Urban Development Secretary Ben Carson is defending his proposal to overhaul HUD programs for low-income housing subsidies that would triple rent for some residents. Think about that. You're at the very low end of the totem pole. You're already getting HUD. I mean, it's not like you have cash in the bank. And just to put it in perspective, a third of the country is in poverty. Half of the country is either in poverty or receiving a poverty wage. 60% of the country couldn't afford a $500 car note or car bill or unexpected emergency bill if they got it. So I'm trying to give you this perspective, the backdrop to which this is taking place. While at the same token, Trump gave him and his cronies trillions in tax cuts, putting those tax cuts on the backs of the American workers to the tune of over $1 trillion. He's raising taxes on Americans. How do you balance that? Well, you're finding ways to balance it on the back of the poor. In this case, he's raising rents on people in the tune of some cases by three times as much. It's our attempt to give the poor people a way out of poverty, Carson told Fox News in an interview, saying the program's work requirements and rent spikes will incentivize people to get on their feet. Carson's proposed legislation will raise from 30% to 35% the amount of their income that Americans on housing assistance pay towards their housing. It would also require that money to be made by at least 15 hours of work at a federal minimum wage level. See, right there. Congressional Black Caucus Chairman Representative Cedric Richard has condemned the proposal as the latest example of the Trump administration's war on poor people, calling it immoral and ill-advised. Essentially, he's saying, look, you must work for somebody else for 15 hours. What if you're working for yourself for that much? What if your income fluctuates? Like, look, these people are already at the low end of the income spectrum. One of the arguments, he says, we're trying to get rid of the disincentives. We're trying to get rid of the incentives that keep people poor and in poverty and these cycles of poverty and all this other stuff. No one ever wants to get rid of the incentives for the corporate welfare. No one ever wants to get rid of the incentives that allow people to put all of this money in the politicians and to bribe these guys. Nobody ever wants to get rid of the incentives that causes the nasty and disgusting habits in our particular society. You hear me all the time talk about this idea of cause and effect. What people do versus what is the outcome of what people do. An idea of calling something moral or immoral and all this other stuff kind of goes by the way because some people consider stuff moral versus not. Ben Carson considers this to be perfectly okay. I consider this to be grossly immoral. Who's right? Regardless of who's right, at the end of the day, you have people who are at the low end of the economic spectrum who's taking a hit. I've been in poverty. When I was ill, when I first started, when I was 17 years old, I was ill. And you're in this weird space. You're not old enough to have a job. So you're not old enough to be in a situation where you're actually working and actually making decent wages and everything else. It's one thing if you were in the workforce for like 20, 30 years. 17 years old, you just started. By the same token, what are you going to do to pay for medical bills? So you end up with like Medicaid, Medicare. What has a condition, has a stipulation. If you work, you will lose it. So what are you going to do? If you work beyond a certain point, you're going to lose it. But the point that they're talking about is like, you know, is poverty. There's no way to live off that amount. But if you work beyond that point, you lose your health care. We have weird policies that goes beyond this disincentive stuff. It's nonsense. You have people at the low end of the economic spectrum who, for all intents and purposes, yes, it's a leaky bucket. There's some people who are going to take advantage of the system, but the majority of the people are just trying to live, and nobody in their right mind wants to be in poverty. Nobody. This idea of raising rents on people by 3 times is nonsense. As somebody who, at that time, I think it was in my like 17, 18, 19, ill constantly, in the hospital, constantly. At some point, trying to get a position, trying to get a job, and getting a job under these weird, like the HUD guidelines, where the HUD guidelines will make a choice on how much you work versus how much you get and everything else. It's not as straightforward as this person works 15 hours or this person is using the system to get in. You will find that there will be some people who will misuse the system. There will be people like myself who did not, who were essentially in it for the time frame just because of the weird situation that they ended up in that weird donut hole. Social Security, SSI, and all those things. They are essentially trying to make those things much, much harder for people to use and much, much harder for people to access. And that's not hitting the people who, for the most part, or may hit people who may misuse it, but it's also hitting people who it's designed for, which is kind of the point. Even stuff with the drug stuff, where they're attacking these people with the pharmaceutical companies, saying, oh my God, the pharmaceutical companies, they're putting out these medications, the doctors are putting these medications. Who do you also think that's hitting? The people who actually need those medications. Whenever they attack these systems, you always have to also look at what is the fallout of you hitting these systems? And is there a better way for you to do it? And not just is there a better way for you to do it, what is the reason that the person is doing it? Ben Carson is essentially helping Trump to balance the budget. And it's not even balancing the budget because they've completely overblown the budget. But saving money on the backs of the people who have the least. As opposed to saying, instead of giving these tax cuts that's giving away trillions of dollars, hey, maybe we need to do things that benefit the public itself and the people who actually came out to voted for me. Yeah, not so much. Not so much. But what I would say is this. Regardless of what I think about Ben Carson, I know that this man goes home every day to this.
And the rocket red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave?
Give it to me.
Over
Hit it.
land of
Hit it. There you go.
and the home of the brave.
Ben Carson doesn't love his wife. Even though he's going to hit the poor, he's going to raise their rents by 3 times. At the very least, those people could turn on YouTube and see that particular clip of Ben Carson's, an image of Ben Carson not loving his wife. If Ben Carson would have loved his wife, he would have never let his wife go out there and do that to herself. That woman shamed herself in that moment on MSNBC. Ben Carson is a disgusting human being. That's what I think. I think it's doubly so. Again, I told you I'm biased. I don't like black Republicans. And this is kind of why. This is not just going to hit blacks. I mean, blacks make up, what, 13% of the population. You're talking about 1/3 of the population in poverty, like outright poverty. You're talking about half of the country either on a poverty wage or in poverty. That goes well beyond blacks from the standpoint of poverty. This is going to hit the country itself, this kind of economic diverse group of the country itself. That being said, blacks are in more desperate poverty, if that makes sense. So this is going to hit us harder. Now, I'm biased on this point. I don't particularly like black Republicans. It's why I didn't necessarily like the ridiculousness that Kanye West was saying. He's a fucking idiot. I assumed that he was a fucking idiot, but he kind of, let's say he fulfilled my expectations. Let's say it that way. If you want to know, honestly, why African Americans don't particularly like black Republicans, this is kind of why. This is kind of why. The reason why they're considered pariahs in the black community, this is kind of why. It's these type of policies that hit the people on the low end of the economic spectrum. And he does it gleefully, saying ridiculousness that somehow raising people's rent by 3 times is going to somehow help them get out of poverty. That's nonsense. That's nonsense. So, Ben Carson bashing the poor with the essentially as one of the horsemen of the Trump administration. I'll leave the article at the bottom. And we can go away with the tunes Ben Carson's wife belting out the Star Spangled Banner.
And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night.
Sing it, Miss Carson.
That our flag was still there.
Sing it.
Oh, say does that star-spangled
Oh, give it to me. Give it to me.
banner wave
Uh-oh, here we go.
o'er the land
Give it to me.
of the free
There we go.
and the home of the
What is it a home of?
brave.
It's not the Whopper, it's the Brave. There you go.